Three of the richest countries in the Islamic world just broke. Not slowly, not quietly, all at once. Qatar's gas empire gutted. Saudi Arabia's last escape route hit. Dubai's whole illusion of safety gone in a single weekend. One lost 17% of its export power for the next 5 years. One watched its only pipeline to the outside world get blown apart. One saw $120 billion vanish from its markets in a single month. These weren't just rich neighbors. They were the engine, the bank, the lifeline holding the entire Muslim world above water. And now, that engine is on fire. For 2 decades, the world looked at Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia and saw something close to invincible. Skylines that rose out of sand, sovereign wealth funds bigger than most national economies, airlines that connected continents, a diplomatic neutrality that was so polished that the rest of the planet treated these countries as the one corner of the Middle East where the rules of the Middle East didn't apply. That illusion is over, because in a span of just a few weeks, every single one of those pillars took a hit that it was never supposed to take. And what's coming for the rest of the Muslim world, the part that depended on these three to stay rich, is uglier than almost anyone is willing to say out loud. Let's be honest about what these three countries actually were. Qatar wasn't just sitting on natural gas. It was supplying roughly a fifth of all the LNG the world burns, the fuel that keeps European homes warm in winter and Asian factories running through the summer. Whole countries had built their energy security around the assumption that Qatari tankers would keep showing up. Saudi Arabia wasn't just an oil producer. It was the financial anchor of the Arab world, the lender of last resort, the deep pocket, the country that other governments quietly would call when they couldn't pay their bills. The Public Investment Fund alone managed $913 billion in assets by the end of 2024, more than the entire GDP of most nations. And the Emirates, particularly Dubai, it wasn't just a city, it was the exit door, the place that every Arab millionaire, every African oligarch, every South Asian professional, every European retiree used to escape the chaos of their own region. Tax-free salaries, world-class airports, police that actually showed up, a property market that doubled your money while you slept. Together, these three weren't just rich, they were the structural support beam holding up an enormous chunk of the Muslim world. 500 million people in neighboring countries depended on Gulf money. Through jobs, remittances, investment, cheap fuel, through the implicit promise that no matter how badly things broke at home, there was always a flight to Dubai. That assumption ran the show for 20 years, and nobody questioned it, because nobody had to. And then on February 28th of 2026, the engine started to seize. What happened over the following 6 weeks didn't just damage three economies, it cracked the foundation that an entire civilization had quietly built itself on top of. Start with Qatar, because Qatar is the cleanest example of how fast a too important to fail country can be turned into a cautionary tale. For years, Qatar's whole strategy was quite simple: be irreplaceable. Sign 20-year LNG contracts with the biggest economies on Earth. Wedge yourself so deep into Europe and Asia's energy security that nobody, friend or enemy, could afford to let anything happen to you. It worked, right up until it didn't. On March 2nd of 2026, Iranian drones struck Qatar energy facilities at Ras Laffan Industrial City and Mesaid Industrial City, the two compounds that produce essentially all of Qatar's LNG. Production stopped. Force majeure was declared. European wholesale gas prices jumped nearly 50% in a single day. Asian LNG benchmarks spiked 39%. And then, it got worse. On March 18th and 19th, Iran came back. Missile strikes set fire across additional LNG facilities at Ras Laffan, including the Pearl gas-to-liquids plant. Damage that was first described as significant turned out to be catastrophic. Qatar Energy CEO Saad Al-Kaabi later admitted to Reuters that 2 of the plant's 14 production trains had been destroyed, and the repair timeline, 3 to 5 years. The lost output, roughly 12.8 million tons of LNG per year, about 17% of Qatar's entire export capacity. And the estimated revenue hole, another $20 billion a year. $20 billion per year for up to a half a decade. And here's the part that should keep European energy ministers awake at night. Qatar had to declare force majeure on the long-term supply contracts that are feeding Italy, Belgium, South Korea, and China. The very contracts that Doha had spent 2 decades selling as unbreakable suddenly weren't. Now think about what that does to a country whose entire identity was built on being the supplier that the world couldn't afford to lose. It doesn't just lose money, it loses leverage. It loses the political premium that comes with being the country that other countries beg to keep open. And once that premium's gone, it doesn't come back the moment that the fires get put out. It comes back when buyers stop pricing in interruption risk. And after watching missiles tear through Ras Laffan twice in 3 weeks, nobody's going back to pre-war pricing assumptions anytime soon. The IMF had already flagged Qatar's softening fiscal cushion before any of this happened. Now Doha is walking into negotiations with insurers, contractors, and buyers from a position that no one in the Gulf has ever been forced into, as a damaged supplier. The largest LNG exporter in the world, humbled by 2 drone runs. But Qatar wasn't even the worst of it, because if you wanted a true measure of how fragile this whole region had become, you only had to look across the border at the country that was supposed to be too big, too prepared, and too well defended to ever get caught off guard. Saudi Arabia spent 40 years preparing for exactly this scenario. Every Saudi planner knew the same uncomfortable truth. If the Strait of Hormuz ever closed, the kingdom's entire oil export economy would be hostage to a stretch of water that it didn't fully control. And so, they built a workaround. The East-West pipeline, known internally as Petroline, runs 1,200 kilometers across the Arabian Peninsula from the eastern province oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. The capacity? Roughly 7 million barrels per day. The whole point was to give Saudi Arabia a way to keep exporting even if Hormuz went dark. In late February of 2026, Hormuz did exactly that. Following the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran on February 28th, Tehran retaliated by effectively closing the strait, choking off shipping for around 20% of the world's seaborne oil. Within days, Gulf oil producers had shut in roughly 13 million barrels per day of production. The whole region went into emergency mode, and Saudi Arabia did exactly what the playbook said, rerouted everything that it could through Petroline. By late March, that pipeline was running at full 7 million barrel capacity, quadrupling the kingdom's Red Sea shipments. Then, on April 9th of 2026, hours after a supposed ceasefire was announced, Iran hit the pipeline. A pumping station went down. Throughput dropped by 700,000 barrels a day overnight. And it didn't stop there. Strikes also damaged the Manifa offshore fields and the Qarayas facility, cutting another 600,000 barrels of daily production capacity. The Ras Tanura refinery, Saudi Arabia's largest at 550,000 barrels per day, had already been hit early in the war and shut for 16 days. Refineries at Jubail, Yanbu, and Riyadh were all damaged. 1 Saudi worker was killed. 7 more were wounded. Let that sink in. The pipeline that was supposed to save Saudi Arabia from a Hormuz shutdown got attacked while a ceasefire was theoretically getting signed. And the backup plan got hit harder than the front door. Riyadh moved fast. Within days, the Energy Ministry announced the East-West pipeline had been restored to full capacity. Manifa came partly back online, but the message had already been sent. Loud and unmistakable. The country with the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the Arab world, the country that prided itself on having a plan B for everything, well, just had its plan B blown up. And now Saudi Arabia is doing something that it hasn't done in years. It's making real, measurable cuts. Vision 2030 megaprojects, the gigacities, the futuristic developments, the trillion-dollar bets on tourism and entertainment have already been getting quietly trimmed and resequenced as oil revenue softened. The IMF noted central government debt rose to around 26% of GDP by end 2024, with deficits projected to persist over the medium term. Now layer war damage on that, layer defense spending, layer the costs of ensuring oil shipments through a strait that may not be safely traversable for months, layer reconstruction on facilities that have just been hit twice, and then ask the obvious question: how many of those Vision 2030 dreams survive contact with this reality? The Public Investment Fund's $913 billion looks enormous, but it can't substitute for an export route in real time. And while Riyadh patches the leak, the third pillar was quietly imploding in plain sight. Dubai never sold oil to the world. Dubai sold safety. That was the entire trick. The whole reason that 4 million people lived there, 90% of them expatriates, was the unspoken contract between the city and the rest of humanity. Come here, work tax-free, raise your kids, buy the apartment, live the life, and never, ever have to worry about waking up to air raid sirens. That contract was torn up in a single weekend. Iranian missiles and drones struck UAE territory hundreds of times. By late March of 2026, Iran had reportedly launched 398 ballistic missiles, 1,872 drones, and 15 cruise missiles at the Emirates, making it the second most targeted country in the war after Israel itself. Most got intercepted, but debris hit the Burj Al Arab. Debris hit Palm Jumeirah. A luxury hotel on the Palm took damage. Residential towers in nearby Manama were hit. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest in the world, handling around 95 million passengers a year, sustained damage and shut down completely on March 1st. In a single day, more than 3,400 flights were canceled across Dubai, Al Maktoum, Abu Dhabi, and Sharjah. Emirates and Etihad suspended operations. Wealthy expatriates reportedly paid up to $250,000 for private evacuation flights. Between February 28th and March 8th alone, 37,000 flights touching the Gulf were canceled. And then came the financial bleed. More than $120 billion was wiped off the market capitalization of the Dubai and Abu Dhabi stock exchanges in roughly a month. The Dubai index plunged 16%. Shares in Emaar Properties, the company behind the Burj Khalifa, fell more than 25%. Real estate sales collapsed by more than 50% versus February 2026 levels, with Goldman Sachs estimating transactions down 37% year on year. Some properties were being dumped at 10 to 15% discounts by sellers that were desperate to get out. Hotel bookings cratered 60% inside 48 hours. The World Travel and Tourism Council estimated the Gulf was losing $600 million in daily visitor spending. Citi cut Dubai's growth forecast from a 4% trend to just 1% for 2026. But the deepest damage isn't on any spreadsheet. It's the conversation happening in expat households across the city. The should we leave talk. The cooling pipeline of professionals who are thinking about moving to Dubai and have now quietly stopped. Because Dubai's growth model doesn't run on oil. It runs on the belief that the city is an island of safety. And once that belief cracks, no amount of cash can paste it back together. A regional support package was rolled out in early April. Financial relief for hospitality, price stability measures for retailers, government messaging insisting that the Emirates would bounce back. But the mood inside the towers? Less convinced. And here's the part that nobody is saying out loud yet. Hey, before that though, if you want more breakdowns like this, the kind that doesn't pull punches and doesn't pretend that the wealthy ones are untouchable, hit subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because what we're about to show you is where this stops being a Gulf story. This is where it becomes everybody's problem. Specifically, the problem of about 1.5 billion Muslims across 3 continents who never saw the bill coming. The dirty secret of the modern Muslim world is how much of it was being held together quietly, invisibly, almost embarrassingly by Gulf money. Start with remittances. According to World Bank data, Saudi Arabia paid out roughly $46.6 billion in personal remittances in 2024. Qatar paid out around $11.5 billion. The Emirates paid out tens of billions more. That money flowed into Pakistan, Egypt, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Yemen, Sudan, Lebanon, Jordan, Morocco, into the household budgets of tens of millions of families whose entire monthly survival depended on a son or brother working a construction site in Dammam or driving a taxi in Dubai. When the airport shut down, when projects froze, when companies started laying off foreign workers to conserve cash, that money stopped. Not gradually, not eventually, immediately. Now, multiply that by the food shock. Roughly 70% of the food consumed by Gulf Corporation Council countries is imported through the Strait of Hormuz, the same strait that Iran has effectively kept closed since late February 2026. The result has been shortages and price spikes across the region. But the second-order effect is what nobody is talking about. The Gulf's normal role as a regional grain redistribution hub for poorer Muslim-majority neighbors is now broken. Egypt, Yemen, Sudan, and parts of the Sahel that depended on subsidized Gulf food flows are now staring at a hunger problem that they didn't have 8 weeks ago. And then there's water. Qatar gets 99% of its drinking water from desalination. Bahrain, over 90%. The Emirates, around 70%. Saudi Arabia, 42%. Desalination plants need fuel, electricity, and uninterrupted operations to function. They're also some of the most strategically targetable infrastructure on the planet. When Iran openly threatened to attack desalination facilities, this stopped being an abstract risk and became a planning emergency. The cost of protecting these plants, military, financial, political, competes directly with every diversification dollar that the Gulf was supposed to be spending on its post-oil future. And then there's the capital. Gulf sovereign wealth funds have been quietly bankrolling everything from Egyptian infrastructure to Pakistani energy projects to Turkish bank rescues. When the Gulf has to plug its own holes, defense spending, reconstruction, emergency liquidity for its own banks, the outward flow of capital that was stabilizing half a continent just simply dries up. Pakistan was already in IMF talks. Egypt was already drowning in import bills. Lebanon was already in collapse. Jordan was already running on Gulf life support. None of these countries had a plan B for what happens when the Gulf itself stops being a plan A. This is what collapse of the Muslim world actually looks like in practice. It's not a single dramatic event, but rather a slow-motion liquidity crunch spreading from Riyadh outward to every capital that's ever assumed the Gulf would always be there to backstop the system. And the people about to feel it hardest aren't the ones in the marble lobbies of Doha or the penthouses of Dubai. It's rather the workers in Karachi whose families are about to stop receiving the monthly transfer that pays for school fees. The bakeries in Cairo where bread prices have already started climbing because the wheat supply chain runs through ports that suddenly cost twice as much to insure. It's the Indonesian and Bangladeshi domestic workers being sent home from Riyadh because the household that hired them is suddenly tightening every belt that it has. The ripple looks something like this. Energy prices spike. Brent crude touched $111 per barrel during the worst of the disruption. That's a windfall for exporters, but that's a wrecking ball for importers. Pakistan, Egypt, Bangladesh, Turkey, Morocco, Indonesia, every Muslim-majority country that buys more energy than it produces gets hit with a brutal inflation shock. Currency started sliding. Central banks burned through reserves that are trying to defend exchange rates. Governments that were already politically fragile became more fragile. Meanwhile, the GCC's role as the region's piggy bank shrinks. Investment commitments get quietly delayed. Promised loans get renegotiated. Construction projects funded by Gulf capital gets paused or canceled. The Qatari and Emirati sovereign funds that were going to bail out half a dozen distressed neighbors suddenly have a list of priorities that are much closer to home. The Emirates actually did sign a $5.4 billion currency swap with Bahrain on April 8th of 2026, an emergency move to stabilize a smaller GCC partner. That kind of intra-Gulf rescue is exactly what these funds are built for, but it's also exactly the kind of move that crowds out everything that they were going to do for poorer countries further afield. Then there's the political dimension. Lebanon is on fire. Israeli strikes there killed hundreds in early April. Yemen, Syria, Sudan are all in some stage of active or frozen conflict. The number of states across the Muslim world that look one bad quarter away from a serious unrest event is genuinely frightening once you start counting them. When the rich neighbors are the ones absorbing the shock, the system holds. But when the rich neighbors become the shock, when Doha, Riyadh, and Dubai are themselves the stories that everyone's reading, the absorption mechanism stops working. Markets call this contagion. Historians call it part of the chapter where things start to look unrecoverable. Diplomats just call it the part where the phone stops ringing because nobody has good news to deliver. This is where the Muslim world is sitting. Not in collapse exactly, not yet, but in the precise structural position that has historically preceded collapse, where the support beams have cracked, the patches are temporary, and the next shock, well, it doesn't need to be very large to bring something down. And the next shock might already be on its way. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The 2-week ceasefire announced on April 8th of 2026, the one brokered by Pakistan, the one that was supposed to give the Gulf room to breathe and rebuild, was already breaking before the ink was dry. Israel never agreed it covered Lebanon. Israeli strikes on Beirut killed at least 182 people in a single day. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz again, barely 48 hours after agreeing to open it. Saudi Arabia's pipeline got attacked anyway. Kuwait reported new drone attacks. Asian markets barely had a day to celebrate before oil prices started climbing back above $97 a barrel on news that the truce wasn't holding. Then, on April 12th of 2026, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance announced that talks between the United States and Iran in Islamabad had failed after 21 hours of negotiations. President Trump immediately declared a U.S. naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, with the U.S. Navy preparing to intercept ships entering or exiting Iranian ports starting April 13th. Iran's IRGC warned that any military vessel approaching the strait would face a severe response. Again, a severe response. Ceasefire signed, pipeline attacked, strait reclosed, talks failed. Naval blockade declared. 5 steps, 5 days. The Gulf isn't in a recovery phase. It's in a holding pattern, waiting to find out whether the next round is worse than the last one. And every additional week that this drags on, the financial damage compounds. The expat exodus accelerates. The food and water systems get more strained. And the chain reaction across the broader Muslim world picks up speed. The pillars cracked, the patches are temporary. The next blow, it doesn't have to be big. It just has to land. So here we are, 3 of the wealthiest countries on this planet, looked at as proof that the modern Muslim world had finally outgrown its crises, all sitting in the same room, holding the same bag, and hoping that the same fragile ceasefire will hold long enough to let them rebuild what's been broken. The engine's on fire. The bank is rationing cash. The lifeline that kept hundreds of millions of Muslims one paycheck above water is fraying in real time. And the story isn't really about whether Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates survive. They will. They have the reserves. They've got the institutions. They have the buffers that most countries can only dream of. The story is about everyone downstream of them. The countries that built their entire post-Cold War survival strategy on the assumption that Gulf wealth would always be there to catch them. That assumption is dead. So what do you think? Are the wealthiest countries in the Muslim world just the first dominoes, or is there still time to stabilize this before the rest of the region goes with them? Drop your call in the comments, and while you're there, subscribe to Fall of Nations for more frontline breakdowns on the stories that nobody else is willing to follow all the way to the bottom.